Thank you so much for joining us, Yusuf. Of course, all the way from outside of Uganda. We'll be glad if you tell us where you are. But before we came on, we were supposed to speak about Nicholas Opio. That was the planned discussion that we'd have. But before we came on, a breaking story about a journalist being shot on the campaign trail of Robert Chagulanyi came through. It's not just Ashraf of Ghetto TV, it's also Lutaya of NBS. It's also our own NTV journalist, Ali Mivule, who was shot at. All three are currently in hospital nursing injuries from what just happened in Masaka. Just to borrow your mind a little bit, this is a show that ideally should be about press freedom. And I'd like for us to start with that. The role that journalists play in this election is so important to be sidelined by violence, to be stopped by the Uganda police force. Just give us your thoughts on that before we discuss the Nicholas Opio.
So they are really related. Nicholas Opio and the plight of journalists covering this election are very related. But let me take you further back and give you sort of a background to what we are seeing right now. Theoretically and practically, if a leader stays in power for over 20 years, the only way they can continue governing, if they're not monarchs, the only way they can continue governing under the so-called getting the mandate of the people is either through violence, intimidation, murder. Governments of this nature tend to murder people. So the only way they govern, they win elections, is through intimidation, murder, bribery. They buy you for all the opposition. They imprison, they bankrupt, right? And they intimidate. So you're seeing a government which is way beyond 20 years, which is theoretically possible to win the hearts and minds of voters. Right now, Museveni can only continue through a combination of all those things, right? He has to bribe, he has to murder, he has to imprison, he has to threaten, he has to bribe. He has to do all those things to keep going. That's the only way it can look like he's winning the hearts and minds of people and getting back to the office, right? So you have to appreciate this dynamic first. This is a clear theoretical position. Wherever they've stayed for over 20 years, they can only act governed through violence, intimidation, and all those crimes. After 20 years, there's nothing like winning the hearts and minds of people. So you can only continue that way, right? So you need to appreciate that theoretical position. So after you appreciate that, then you put everything in context, right? You put Nicholas Opio in context, you put Johnson in context, you put NGOs in context, you put the opposition in context. There will be murdered, they will be imprisoned, they will be threatened, they will be bankrupted, they will be kidnapped. All those things are going to happen to them because it is way past the theoretically and practically possible time for somebody to continue winning hearts and minds, right? As I've argued plenty of times in my Observer pieces, is that the only choice that Museveni has now is violence. Even if he doesn't like it, he can continue through killing and murdering, imprisoning, and threatening, and bankrupting. That's the only way he can continue, even if he doesn't like it. But as long as he wants to continue governing, it's caught up between violence and only violence, right? So that's the only way he can govern. And that's how we should think about our friends who have been hit today by security forces.
Yusuf, there seems to be a multi-pronged approach to dealing with the press in this campaign, particularly this campaign season. One, we've had restrictions on what can and can't be covered by the press coming from regulators, like the Uganda Communications Commission. The press has also now had to contend with fresh regulation coming from the Uganda Media Council on registering, fresh registration of all journalists. The Uganda Electoral Commission has also issued fresh demands on journalists who would like to be accredited for the elections to first get Media Council accreditation. But in the midst of all this, journalists are also still dealing with the everyday censorship in newsrooms and outside of newsrooms. Is this just a construct of the election, or this is how the Ugandan society has been for some time?
Okay, I'm going to go back to what I said at the very beginning, but you have to appreciate this. We entered a terrain of human rights, right? The only language that we speak as politicians across the African continent or everywhere is the language of human rights, right? So our government can be kicked out of office only through the language of human rights. And as we said, Museveni is abusing rights. right, is abusing every single right that you can think about of those who disagree with his stay in power, right? He's abusing their right so as to continue stay as the president of the republic. When I say the language we speak now is human rights, one of the ways that governments of Museveni's nature are falling is through people protesting governments out of office. And Museveni is fully aware of that. Now, what he has done, right now he's quite successful, is to prepare for any moment of uprising, any single moment of uprising. So to this end, he will deal with the opposition, beat them to pulp, imprison, or bankrupt them, or actually murder them. But he has to deal with those who are reporting these things too. Right? There's no way he can carry on without dealing with those who are reporting. Because if you report, the human rights crusade across the world will gang up against him. Right? So this is the problem with reporting. If you report atrocities, you mobilize others to feel the pain of those atrocities and they come up and resist. Right? If you murder, say, 10 people in massacre right now, and the reports are spreading so fast, you can galvanize other parts of the country to rise up and resist this sort of continuous murder. So you have to make sure you rein in on those who are reporting the abuses of human rights, right? So right now he has put together an entire network, right, which has mobilized the Uganda Communication Commissions, the Media Center. All these restrictions on journalists covering Museveni's mess and crimes are part of the network to make sure you abuse these human rights as you're doing, but they aren't reported. All right. So that's the context in which you have to appreciate this man, that he has to continue running, but he's running by abusing human rights. So he's dealing with those who are opposing him, but he has to deal with those who are reporting these human rights issues as well. All right. So you have to appreciate this context to put whatever somebody is doing against journalists in perspective.
If we could put this story into context, what kind of context do editors need to place this story of journalists who've been shot and killed for the press tomorrow, for the release tomorrow, for the news tonight? What context should this story be in?
Yeah, I mean, for the dailies, and you just have to report on the violence, right? Because people need to know. And now with the surge of social media, the pictures are already, the Goa is already trending on all these social media platforms. What media houses to do as editors, you have to give these pictures credibility, because people are going to be picking up the papers to find whether you can authenticate what actually happened, right? It's difficult for the reporter right now. You have to report the story as unfolding, all right? But I appreciate the level of self-censorship, the threats from government, because you're a business, you can easily be shut down, or your license can be withdrawn, whatever. But it's difficult. You're going to look like stupid people if social media and international media are reporting on these atrocities and you're reporting on them. I think the context is simple. First, let's report it as it is, right? Report the story as it's unfolding. I mean, we have. It's difficult right now for the reporter in terms of violence, in terms of unfairness. The journalist has to side with the downtrodden, right? I think that's a very basic position the editors have to take.
All right, let's now get to the discussion of Nicholas Opio. At the start of the week, the Uganda police force picked up Nicholas Opio for allegedly money laundering. They spent with him almost 48 hours in investigations, took him to have a proper bail application, and then thereafter, they sentenced him to Kitalia prison. So we just need to find out, in terms of Nicholas as a human rights defender, was he targeted, or was this an actual case that the state had against him?
Okay. So Nicholas Opio is a human rights lawyer, right? Renowned for his advocacy towards human rights. He also runs a civil society organization, Chapter 4, all right? And he has so smartly packaged himself as friends with foreign forces, democracy forces outside Uganda, right? He's friends with all the ambassadors of the big powers coming to Uganda, often go to his house or his office to catch up and let him give them an update on what is happening in the country, right? So he is an institution, if you want to put it that way. He's an institution that, you saw the pictures of him hobnobbing with the American ambassador, the new German ambassador who came in not too long ago, met at his office and they were chatting and you saw the pictures. So, like I said, the countries, Museveni has to continue by abusing human rights. In dealing with those who report human rights, the journalists, he also has to deal with those who are actually advocating for human rights, right? Those who are advocating safety and respect for human rights, they're going to be dealt with, right? So you have to first appreciate Nicolas Opio in this frame, that he is part of the ensemble of those that have to be dealt with, right? He's part of the reporters, activists, advocates who are siding with the everyday person, right? And I want you to appreciate us moving on, that we are getting closer to January 14. January 14 is a very wonderful day in this country. And Museveni has so much prepared for the aftermath of January 14. Museveni is not preparing for the election. He's actually preparing for what will happen after January 14. So whatever he's doing is to make sure January 14 doesn't catch him on the right side, on the wrong side of preparedness. So what he has done, among other things, is, for example, what just happened, no campaigning in Kampala and Mukono, right? Centers where opposition forces have the strongest power, and they can often, they can campaign a procession through Kampala, and they're saying, we're not going anywhere. We're going to Nakasero, right? We're not going back home. We got Nakasero. And if they're over 10,000, it's very difficult for Museveni's forces to deal with them. If they are, Museveni doesn't want to be put in a position where he will kill 30, 40 Ugandans in front of cameras, right? 100, because he will be forced to murder these Ugandans. Now, he doesn't want that. He has to make sure you keep all this stuff away, because he's gonna murder Ugandans in order to stay in power. And the spots are Kampala, Mukono, right? Now, because this is the sort of preparedness he is into, preparing to murder Ugandans, because his only choice, he has to first settle ordinary scores, simple scores, go for the low-hanging fruits, deal with the reporters, deal with the human rights activists. You have to appreciate Nicolas Opio in this context, because Nicolas Opio will be out there, whoever thrown in jail, Nicolas Opio will be first report there. And then media houses will be knocking on his door so that he can give them the next updates, right? So you have to understand Nicolas Opio in this lens, that he is in that very difficult position that as an activist, he's also a human rights defender. He will be fighting for those human rights of people, and he'll be keeping up, and he's got so many friends out of this country. And someone doesn't want that. He doesn't want to have a public image. So you have to rein in Nicolas Opio as well, and as early as possibly could. Right? I don't see Nicolas Opio coming out. Is it tomorrow? No, I don't see him coming out. My prediction is they're going to keep him, because you're better off keeping him on, holding on to him, and let him stay after January 14. Right? So you have to appreciate this context. The other thing is that, which I think I've said, is that Nicolas Opio has packaged himself as the link between local and international forces, right? Often in our banana republics, if you want to move the democratic agenda, you have to have the connection with outside forces that are, speaking for the same right. You have to have money, right? And Nicolas Opio, whether the supposition is right or wrong, he's been there. He runs an NGO. You have to get resources, right? So he's been there. And so one of the suspicions is that he could be the link through which money is coming in from elsewhere into the country. But he can't be stupid to make his bank account very available. He can't make it easily accessible. Like they told us, they went onto his account, there's so much money. Opio is not an idiot. He's not an idiot. He knows how bad this government is looking at and checking. His house was broken into not too long ago. So he's aware they'll be coming for him. So he's not an idiot for government to come up and tell us, we found so much money on his account. No, he can't do that, right? But the thing I've said is that as they're preparing for the events of January 14, especially after January 14, they're reining in on all those people, journalists, activists, all of them will have to be thrown in jail. I'm sure they're going to be coming for you really quickly.
That's a very early prediction. But Yusuf, there's a conspiracy that was floated out there immediately Nicholas was arrested, and it was carried mostly by government accounts, that money being used by NGOs in the ordinary day of their job is to enhance the opposition's position, and also in a way to create foreign powers to take over the sovereignty of the country. The press hasn't questioned the veracity of this statement, but also the people making this statement haven't made themselves available for interview. How can the press hold government to account on this looming allegation that money that's coming to NGOs to do their day-to-day job, which might even be human rights work, is apparently to dent the sovereignty of the country?
Hey, look, that's bullshit from the government. This is absolute baloney from the government. You know, it's really funny. In fact, if you ask me, I really think NGOs in Africa, in Uganda, are part of the mess, right? This is my argument for a long time, that NGOs are actually part of the mess in this country. All our elites, the smartest Ugandans, if you come to think about, in NGOs making big monies, and they're having a beautiful life, driving in four-wheel drives and sitting in air-conditioned office, and they're kept away from the plight of ordinary Uganda, right? This men, if you look at the profiles of people in the NGOs, if they're involved in our politics, doing actual activism, Uganda would be far better, right? But they have been cushioned from the pains that Museveni has suffered onto his countrymen. They are cushioned by the privileges that come with being in a position where you can easily attract resources and do a bit of work and also make some money, right? You look at all of them, they're highly intelligent people, super educated, super smart, but they are cushioned from the realities of the country, right? I've argued over and over again that actually NGOs are part of the mess in Uganda. In fact, Museveni should be very pleased that they don't only cushion these elite from actively participating in politics, but they also cushion the mess, right? You know, I mean, it's HIV/AIDS, NGOs are doing frontline work instead of medical facilities. It is famine in the country instead of the government, NGOs are doing frontline work, right? So they are cushioning government from feeling the anger from the populace. You know, so they're part of the mess in a way. There's some sort of shock absorbers for the government. So somebody should be proud of the work that NGOs are doing, right? But this is where it gets complicated. They often get these resources to do their work, and most of this work also includes human rights advocacy, democracy promotion, constitutionalism, etc., etc., right? Now, the danger is that, you know, in the smallness of their contribution to democracy and human rights, it's like super small, I can guarantee it's super small. In the smallness of their contribution, Museveni's government has become so paranoid that it's not taking chances, even this very small contribution to democracy and human rights that human NGOs are doing. So he's raining so hard in on them, right? He's raining hard in on them to the point that he's frozen all their accounts, right? So this is the thing, that even if you look at Nicholas Opio's work, he's perhaps the most celebrated activist in this domain. It's small compared to the pain that we have in the country. It's small. We need everybody to come on board. But in the smallness of his contribution, which has given him plenty of visibility, they've gone in for him. They've gone in for him. So there's no crime that Nicholas Opio has done. He's been doing this human rights work advocacy for a very long period, right? He's been getting money, you know, and they know it. All of them, there's so many, all of them have been getting money. So if the accusation is money, that's a waste of our time. How else did he establish Chapter 4? How else did you have the NGO Forum? You know, how many are registered in this country? All of them are, majority, like 90%, are bankrolled by foreign agents, right? How come they've never taken over our sovereignty? But if you flip this argument about sovereignty and how stupid it could be, I mean, you know, like how big the percentage is funded by foreign sources, how budget is funded by foreign sources. How come they've never taken over our sovereignty, right? You know, how many Chinese loans are suffocating the government? They've never taken over our sovereignty. So it's baloney. absolute nonsense for you to come up and say Nicholas Spear has been caught up money laundering. In fact, the biggest money launderer is the government of Uganda. What's the biggest money launderer? They're picking money from foreign banks and using for private means. You know, I mean, the list is so long, we can't even start enumerating it. Right? So the biggest money launderer is government of Uganda. But, you know, power corrupts. Power corrupts. It corrupts irretrievably. This is what is happening in this country. That, you know, I was reading the opinion that Karinaki said. I mean, you're dating the same girl. All of you are getting bankrolled by foreign forces, but you want to do it alone. Nobody else should get the sources from there. But also they get them in good time because they're cushioning your mess. But the little work they're doing in pursuit of the original ideas of democracy and human rights, you know, you're going to rein in on them.
Yusuf, very, very finally, if I could ask you, what kind of election are we going to have? And are the calls justified for us to postpone the election, or we go through with it?
You know, I'm glad you asked me that. I was listening, my village mate, the Archbishop of Uganda, Dr. Charles Cyprian Luanga, and you know, when he read out a statement from the Joint Christian Council that the election should be postponed, right? It's very interesting that they called on it, but the only reason which they would give was COVID-19 and police brutality, right? But they know so much more than we know. And they've looked ahead and seen that the possibility of killing many, many people because of this election in the next 2 weeks is high, right? Only in 2 days, November 18 and 19, we could have lost about 400 or 500 people, right? Like about 400. You see, the Joint Christian Council is super connected because, you know, the media stops covering. We don't cover those who lost their limbs, those who are dying in hospital weeks, 2 weeks, 3 weeks after. Many people were shot in their house. Many people died out of suffocation. Many people, you know, the deaths are so many and media can only cover too much, right? Not every death comes out into the public domain, but you can appreciate that the Joint Christian Council, which has the biggest electorate and then control over the biggest number of people. And it's more sophisticated in their organizational work. So they know what actually happened in November 18 and 19. We must have lost over 500 people if you take the count properly. And the victims who are having broken bones and scars and permanent injuries, there could be over 1,000. So they know, right? And they are looking at the apocalypse, which is coming on January 14th, because they know, Museveni is charged, he's ready to kill as much as possible because he has to stay in power. And we said at the very beginning that theoretically that's his only way, right? Because, you know, the time he spent in office, there's no way you can win the hearts and minds of Ugandans. That's the only way. Now, being aware of that, that's the only way you can stay in power. People have looked ahead to say, hey, look, you know, we're going to lose so many people because this man is ready to stay. And these people are not, you know, like the Bob Wine group is not, they're not prepared for anything, but all they're prepared for is we want change, right? And the harder somebody is going to come onto them, I mean, lives will be lost. So the Joint Christian Council looked ahead, saw this possible apocalypse, and they said, why don't we postpone this thing by the next 3 years? Maybe Museveni will be dead or could have changed his mind on overstaying in power, right? So this was the call of suspending the election. And you have to appreciate the Joint Christian Council on these terms. They couldn't put it in the language that I put it, but you have to appreciate these terms.
And Yusuf, the thing about language that I also wanted to say is the press can't say the things that you're saying. For example, we can't say that Museveni kills people. You have to balance stories, say the people that were shot downtown were shot by the Uganda police force, or people known to the Uganda police force in the enforcement of COVID-19 SOP. So the language also in which it is said, is this the time that the press should open its doors and give platform to people who are openly critical of the Museveni government and allow them to use their language on their platforms, language which the government already is criminalizing?
I mean, you'll be shut down the next day. You can't afford to sound like an analyst if you're a media house. It's only the analyst who can sound like that. But also if you're the church, you can't sound like that either. You have to cushion whatever you feel in your gut. in some very appreciable language, right? This is what the Joint Christian Council they did, sound polite. But this is what the Wananchi feels. And the Joint Christian Council feels this too. That's why they're calling for postponement of the election. It's this feeling that we're gonna die. You know, the arrest of Bobby Wine happened as an innocent event, right? And we lost all these many lives. Even if to one life lost, it would be a dent to our moral and democratic psyche. Even to a one life lost, right? So we lost these many lives because of, you know, the arrest of this charismatic opposition candidate, right? And coming because, you know, Museveni is going to steal the election, right? As he has always done, he's going to steal it. And everybody who's on the campaign trail opposing Mr. Museveni knows this for a fact. It's going to happen, right? We've had so much evidence in the subsequent elections to know that actually Museveni steal this election. So what's going to happen? They're all looking forward to January 14. Moments to and moments after, Museveni is prepared for it, right? People are going to die. So what do you do? What do you do is maybe call for a postponement. And I think that was a very plausible position from the church, the Joint Christian Council. But speaking to us as observers and as journalists, if you think about the type of election we're going to have, I mean, I don't know what to say. I mean, we didn't have to have this election in the first place, right? But if you're going to have an election, Museveni is going to come back as president of the republic. But what is all of us have to be looking forward to, and I'm sure Mr. Museveni is also watching, is what will the Wananchi do after January 14? I am 100% sure the Wananchi also don't know what they should do. Kizza basically has you know, flirted with Plan B. The Wananchi don't know. And I'm sure Museveni also is not really sure, but he's trying to prepare possibility. Arrest Nicholas Opio, right? Come for Raymond Mujuni. Beat up all the journalists as much as possibly could. Restrict media coverage. He's likely to switch off Wi-Fi, rather internet and social media sites. We're keeping it, but social media outside media sites are going to be off January maybe 13, January 14, right? He's going to do all the things. And this is the kind of election that we're looking at. I don't know if even the word election qualifies, but this is the kind of election we're looking at, right? So that is the great president.
All right, thank you so much for speaking to us, Yusuf. And of course, like I said, you're outside of the country. This saves you a great deal. You don't have to be picked.
I'm coming back to Uganda the next few days, so you know.
I don't think you want to announce that publicly, but thank you so much for allowing us to speak to you on this show.
Welcome.
All right, thank you so much for joining us again, Angelo. And we seem to call on you every time we have crisis. The first immediate crisis is that today, journalists who are covering Robert Kyagulanyi, 3 of them were targeted and beaten. One of them is an NTV journalist, Ali Mivule. The other is Daniel Lutaya, who is for NBS, and then Ashraf, who is badly injured and still in nursing in a hospital at Rubaga. From your own understanding, the way this kind of violence of targeting journalists in the manner that they're being targeted, is it unique to this election? Is it new?
I think so, but we talked about this actually. I feel like now we're going to be on a loop until the election is over. That on the one hand, the way that the media continues to define the election, and I asked the question, you know, what election the last time we spoke, and the way that the state agencies, particularly the security sector, are looking at what's going on, polar opposites, if you'd like. You know, before the recent events, you and I were talking about, I think this is 2 weeks ago, I told you that I think the security establishment are going about this period as if they're in the middle of containing an insurrection. In fact, after using that term, I saw that the president went ahead and included the term insurrection in his statements about changes he was making to the leadership of the police. So the question I would ask you, actually, Raymond, is if the security sector and the president himself insist that there is an ongoing insurrection which is being contained, or actions are being taken to contain it, why do you continue to define the political participation and events which are closely related to what they're doing as consistent with a democratic process we can call an election at the end? That would be my question to you.
Yes, and I think that this is where the crisis comes in, because as the press, we ought to report on the election, because this is an election unlike any other. It's a scientific election where the public relies on the media to know what candidates are saying, what their manifestos are. But also, as a function of our knowledge on the society, we now know that this election is a very unique election, if you can even call it that. So we would be accused of bias if we took the route that you're suggesting. And that might be the question that I ask. And should editors speak back and say, based off of what we know, this is not an election?
I think that editorially, it gets to a point where if what you're reporting and what the public is observing and what the public is experiencing are two different things, the editors then must take a decision and say, look, we are going about reporting an election as, business as usual. We're talking about rallies, and that may be true to the extent that we have a large body of municipal elections, people running for parliament, people running for LC5. But when it comes to the presidency, I think we need to make it clear that this is no longer a normal process, and skip what is going on. I'll tell you why. So the public is not, they're not very far away from the issues that we are dealing with, except that our narrative is kind of removed. I'll give you just a shorthand or political analysis, if you'd like. So you have a president who has been around for 33 years. So it is quite clear for most people going to the poll whether or not they're going to vote for him or they're going to choose someone else. So and especially with our elections, it always comes down to a two-horse race, right? So we know that there's polarization that right now is between the president and Robert Chagulanyi, who is the leader. That ideally would have been our presidential set. In a normal election, we would go about looking at what they're saying, looking at their manifestos. All of that has disappeared because of the way the people power organization has been characterized. Right now, it is borderline. They're really borderline being treated as legitimate people power organization and NAP in strict legal practice right now. What you call an illegal society, but they haven't not been banned, you see? But I think that is how they are being treated, as an illegal society. And those who are associating with them, they're not really taking part in the re-election of Robert Chagulanyi. As far as the security services are concerned, they are engaging in illegal assemblies, participating in an illegal society. Possibly, the terms terrorism and treason are next to each other with regard to that process. Now, that's the polarity, and those are the two issues. The other is that in terms of the re-election of Yoweri Museveni, again, for the public, it is quite clear that the difference between parliamentary elections and the presidential election is that parliamentary candidates see a very huge turnover every election cycle. It is very contested, yes, but it is widespread political competition that takes place at a local level, in which change of your member of parliament or your LC5 is 65% likely in most races. The difference between that and the presidential election is that there has been no change whatsoever as to who is president, whether this president was running the country under a sustained period of 9 elections, or even now when there are supposedly democratic elections. And the way that the presidency has secured that perpetuity has been largely by the ill treatment of his opponents at election time, as we know. But at the same time, the uniqueness you're talking about is that with regard to Yoweri Museveni's status alone, the nature of the government of Uganda is so skewed that you really have a government within a government because of the imperial nature of the presidency. It is a huge establishment. In fact, and this is for lawyers and others, or maybe journalists like you, but from where I sit, I think that the constitutional order, in fact, has run its course. Because when you think about it, with such a huge presidential establishment within our government, there is no other, because in terms of the checks and balances, the idea of the republic is that you have a president who's an executive, but his decisions might be checked by a capable judiciary and the legislature and commented upon by the public. It's called the fourth estate. Under the current unique circumstances, the president is really unchallenged. The presidency is really unchallengeable by the other arms of government. So you cannot quite even say that the Republican Constitution is holding. In practice and as a matter of legal debate. The second thing is that the nature of the imperial presidency is very personal in nature. You see, I'll give you an example. The way this presidency is personalized is that even non-elected members of the presidential household wield a lot of political and administrative influence. Am I wrong? So because you have got those two things, that presidential powers are widespread, that the presidency itself as a creature of the Constitution has completely submerged the rest. And then the presidency is so personalized, if such a person now, in this case, Comrade Museveni is running, in an election such as this one here, okay? It is basically the institutions of the state are personal instruments, if you'd like, to continue his rule. I think there's no doubt in the minds of most people that he will prevail in a few weeks' time. And I remember being asked the question almost 6 months ago by a member of the Foreign Press Association who said, this Bobi Wine is on an upswing. What do you think? Is he going to have a chance at the poll? And I said, no. I said, Bobi Wine, his election is dead in the water. And he's dead in the water not because you and I don't see that there may be support for him, but because structurally, the way the state is organized right now, under our current presidency, it is almost nearly impossible to get a different result at the poll. Now, I think editorially, we should be saying these things. And it should be an important footnote that, our narrative is not used to window dress a process that in any circumstances would never be called a fair election by any standard. Yes.
Angelo, there's people who believe, particularly who are supporters of the NRM, in the utopia that the three arms of government are functional. And if we took an editorial route in which we question the available checks and balances, they would accuse us of bias. They would also accuse us of carrying a voice that should ideally belong to the opposition. What the press has done in this election cycle is offer the opposition at least platform for them to address the biggest campaign issue at the moment, which is violence, the way they're being met by violence. But there's now a consensus. The violence is also now being meted out onto journalists. So the question is, do we join the pack of the opposition and say, okay, there has to be a basic minimum within which the democracy of Uganda is argued for. And if that basic minimum doesn't exist, then the press cannot pretend to have an unbiased coverage, a free and fair coverage for all candidates.
Well, there are two distinctions one has to make. Of course, we can talk about the present poll, but in terms of reporting on an election, which is an event that occurs every 5 years, the press has two roles. One is to call, of course, we talk about the procedural, because we judge elections by saying, do they meet a certain standard, right? Because that is really what the Constitution wants you to do, is to say that, that certain things have been done and people have offered themselves, and you can now guarantee that through that process, a new government is set up which has the people's mandate, by implication, because they have elected leaders of their own choice. So that is written into our Constitution, because ideally that happens every 5 years, and there's some renewal of the administration, and through the through the pleasure of the Ugandan public that says, okay, NRM or some other group has done so well, so an election, reflects that confidence. So that is the procedural thing. The other is actually that elections are only periodic. In the meantime, society continues to exist. And what the Constitution does is to support broad social agendas, you see? And if there is harm, in my view, coming from any quarter, including from an election, to those broad social goals, that harm should be brought to light. In other words, you can't report in an election where essentially the person who is running the election has almost guaranteed that he cannot lose, and also chooses at any one time to deploy the other instruments of to instrumentalize the other arms of the state to reflect his broad will. But I think the real harm that, if you'd like, this perpetual presidency or the imperial presidency, whatever it is doing, is that it is replacing its own view of society with a very personal view of Yoweri Museveni. I think that he has been a consequential leader, but I'll give you one of those dilemmas. You see, after 33 years, going to 34 years, the system that he runs, when he talks about, for example, the challenge to the sovereign goals of Uganda, and I read in his nomination speech, he talked about in other words, the broad sovereignty of African people as reflected by the freedom of the Ugandan people, freedom of African people, and so on and so forth. When he describes that the sovereign goals, remember that the sovereignty he's referring to, by and large, is basically a personal project. And the reason it is suffering is because, being personal in nature, we are caught in this situation where it cannot be transferred in the way the Constitution intends. You cannot, and people have said this, you can talk about an election in Uganda, but really the term you're looking at is a selection, by the powers that be. And if sovereignty is personal in nature, for example, what does this mean for other broad things? I mean, the Constitution guarantees the president immunity, but now, we have seen other people acting with impunity under the general umbrella that immunity of the president now can be extended, because he does, and he can extend it by will. when soldiers and other people misbehave on his behalf, and he can guarantee them that they won't be harmed. And in fact, he goes ahead and says, in fact, in the case of the latest police changes, he says, if you're not doing this thing which people think actually is really benefiting me, then you have got no place in the, in the force. And you dial back, several months ago when he called the 333 MPs who removed the age limits as national heroes. It was a very partisan affair, as we know. Again, it is one of those constitutional changes that has only one bearing, which is for his benefit. If he can, essentially gift his immunity that exists in the Constitution for him to act in bold ways that are, that support the broad social goals, it complicates the situation. So for journalism, this is a kind of it's not just a democratic or political crisis, if you'd like, because as election it comes with violence and other things and other types of instability. What it is a broad social crisis. And I feel that what Ugandan journalism has not done well is to set itself up to debate those broad social agendas. If you put it like that, one cannot say that it is partisan activity. It can only be partisan activity because it is called so by those who don't like that activity. And I think the reason why journalists are being targeted is because anytime a journalist is to speak and raise these issues outside what is considered tolerable, and if you're not a cheerleader to the process that they view as not hurting the president, his image or his agenda, then that is what is being called good journalism. Now, I think that if that is what you're facing, then the public is not getting the kind of the public is not getting the kind of service or duty of care that the fourth estate is mostly associated with.
Angelo, I want us now to switch gears. This week, you sit on the board of Chapter 4, the executive director of Chapter 4, Nicholas Opio, who is also a founding member, a founding panelist on this show, The Fourth Estate, consistent panelist of The Fourth Estate, was arrested and detained and charged for money laundering. And there's been a crisis within the newsroom itself on, do we report this as money laundering charges, or do you report this as an affront on a human rights defender? And I think that the crisis has even been made worse by the fact that the state hasn't provided a file of investigation to go by. So we've seen a charge sheet, but we don't know the investigations that are backing the charge sheet. From just your own perspective, someone that has a little bit of knowledge, are you happy with the context the press has offered this story? And if you're not, what different context would you love for the story to have?
Well, on the money laundering issue, well, I can tell you the press hasn't been reporting money laundering. You know what's ironic is that a couple of months ago, I think when there was the arrest of these comedians for hate speech, I saw a senior police officer who I could say is a former student of mine, who was in a class that I gave, in a nearby East African country, designed to help the police of about, I think there were 12 African countries in our class, deal with the complex changes on money laundering. And my particular class was on non-conviction based asset recovery. In other words, when the police go for your assets, because they suspect those assets are proceeds of a crime, what would be the chain of actions that a good police investigation takes? I know a little bit about money laundering. If anyone in the newsroom were interested, in fact, they would read something called the NRA. Of course, it's not the National Resistance Movement. It's called the National Risk Assessment, which is a document that the Financial Intelligence Authority of Uganda puts out to say which are the key risk areas for money laundering. The key risk areas of money laundering in Uganda are largely real estate, okay? And real estate linked to the huge leakage of funds from state coffers. There are some concerns, of course, money laundering linked to clear criminal activity, drug dealing and things like that. But the people who you find in the initial NRA assessment, these are not, I have not seen an NGO leader in that group. I have read the technical assessments, the real risk of money laundering that other financial institutions, such as the Financial Action Task Force, that, is a global body that examines countries that actually is concerned about Uganda right now. When they take stock, and if you examine the evidence, money laundering is essentially an activity of the cannibalization of state funds by the establishment elite on the one hand, okay, and the, if you'd like, the unsuccessful, it's not even intended that way, because what really happens is that regulators in Uganda are largely weaker than those they regulate. And that also is the subject of a weak political process to support really harsh regulators. This is my long way of telling you that at Chapter 4, there is absolutely no possible reason why that organization would engage remotely in money laundering. We have a relationship with the FIA where we provide compliance assistance to their process and to the process of other NGOs. And through our partners, we have been trying to clean the NGO register, because NGOs actually do have problems complying with FIA rules. Why would an organization that is committed, to keep making the civil society clean, deal with money laundering? And we have offered a view about this charge, which is basically that it is political, and that it will fall apart in court, and that like many things about this unfortunate incident involving our director, that it is, he's been caught up in evolving and changing political circumstances. If anyone is interested in looking at what is wrong with the arrest of Nicholas Opio, I think you take two sides. Okay, to be fair, look at the record of those who are standing against him in court, including the establishment there. What do they stand for? And then take Nicholas and ask what he stands for. The public can judge. I think that, when I first came to work for Nicholas, I made this argument to him because he sought me out. And he says, Angelo, I'm setting up this organization, come. I was the first secretary to the board. And I said, Nicholas, look, the Ugandan crisis is that institutions that are meant to protect the public interest have been so undermined by the political processes of our time that it may come right down to individuals and other centers of authority. Because, of course, we can now talk about traditional centers of authority, academia, the press, the justice sector, and so on and so forth. Like these have been so undermined that about 8 years ago, I told him, Nicholas, we need to build an organization that has the ethical, if you like, has earned the ethical, authority that in a crisis, that when that organization or when that individual speaks, in a contentious crisis, that at least the Ugandan people have a chance, to step back from the brink of total chaos. But I know him well, and I think that he has tried his best to build an ethical record, to be a center of integrity. I think these charges will eventually fizzle out, and the punishment being meted through the courts by his political persecutors will fall flat on his face.
Angelo, I need to ask you very finally, and this is a question that editors normally ask reporters, and I know that you've asked many reporters this question. What's the big story? What's the big story? Nicholas is getting arrested, charged with money laundering, sent away to Kitalia prison. What's the big story? What are we missing?
I think people I have had all kinds of speculation about this situation. Look, I think as an organization, we have nothing to hide. If we had more time, we could really get into the weeds of some of the concerns. When Nicholas was arrested, I did the usual thing of reaching out to our friends and partners on the other side of the table to find out what their concerns are. They have raised issues about human rights monitoring and its relationship to financial sanctions,